Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is part two, responding to your comments on the video, Vinegar and Ellen G. White, a historical and scientific investigation. Interestingly enough, I'm beginning to dabble a little bit with the analytics, and over 80% of you who watch these videos actually are not subscribed. So I highly recommend, if you've been benefiting from the series, please go ahead and subscribe. You can also ring that notification bell so that you're the first to know when new content goes out. Also, if you haven't already, I highly recommend that you watch part one, which is the presentation on Vinegar and Mrs. White. Please watch that before you watch this video. I think it will be much more beneficial for you. Okay, so some quick background on Mrs. White for those of you who don't know her. Mrs. White is the most translated female nonfiction author in the history of literature. She's one of the founding figures of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and her writings emphasized wholeness, linking physical health, mental clarity, and spiritual vitality as inseparable. Okay, so just a little bit about me before we move on. My name is Dr. Kazzi. I'm a registered dietitian. I have a BS and a master's in nutrition and dietetics. I have a PhD in rehabilitation science. I went to Loma Linda University for my higher education. I'm a published researcher. I'm a cookbook author, and I'm in clinical and private practice, as well as I am a practicing Adventist. And this tends to be misunderstood, but I just want to make sure I clarify that, and I'll talk more about that later. All right, the disclaimer. So it's interesting to me when I go through some of the comments and I realize people completely miss this, but the information being provided here is for you to utilize your own judgment. I am not telling anyone what to do or what to believe. The purpose of me being on here on YouTube and making this series is to lay out the known data on this topic, which up until now has not been thoroughly addressed by a nutritional expert in the Adventist community, which is why I took it upon myself to tackle this. There are tons of comments, hundreds under these videos, so it was quite a challenge to fish out the most appropriate comments that I thought would be most beneficial to those who are listening and watching. Obviously, I didn't put all of them, and several of them were kind of repeat questions of the same question, so after skimming through them, I've selected a handful. There are, a handful of, I would say, more controversial comments, and there are wonderful positive comments. And I wanted to bring the best of both worlds to you so that you can sense the community and understand the thought processes of your brothers and sisters. So I wanted to acknowledge a couple of comments that I thought were very thoughtful and encouraging and would also be encouraging to you guys. This one is, love this so much. So many questions I've had for years are being answered. Thank you so much. Keep making these, please. I still have lots of other questions. And then another person said, I very much appreciate your research and perspective. We all have free choice and people can take it or leave it. I believe one of the most important things is how we treat each other when we have differing views. And this is such a big, powerful comment, and I really appreciated it. I think we can get so caught up in the nitty-gritty and the nuances of these things that we forget the bigger picture of loving our brothers and our sisters in Christ. And so wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate that. This person said, I love this series. I think that this provides a lot of clarity and it's very valuable. Thank you. I hope you will continue to do them. I can think of several more subjects to talk about, and I'm sure you can too. Yes, and they're coming. This person commented, great video. Thank you for explaining this so elegantly, eloquently, and respectfully. Thank you for recognizing the amount of respect I'm trying to utilize during this whole process. I can't wait for the next one. Thank you so much. Looking forward to sharing them with you. This person wrote, you have the patience of a saint. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks for so considerately and compassionately answering accusations. It's inspiring. And yes, there were quite some heavy accusations that were put out there. I don't know if they bother me as much as they probably would bother someone else, but it's because I feel like I'm on the side of correct reasoning that it doesn't really influence me as much, and you'll understand why in a bit. This person wrote, truly superb presentation, not overly scientific or technical, down to earth, easy to understand for the layperson. Perhaps the majority of the viewers. And then particularly appreciated is the stewardship of the time and the sense of sharing your nutrition and dietary knowledge. Thank you for that. The irony is that we, Seventh-day Adventists, and peoples in general are still today learning how to eat after almost 7,000 years post-creation. Isn't that interesting? So the keen guidance from the inspired pen of Mrs. White and your altruistic teaching is always a plus for one's well-being. Thank you for that. And I totally agree. And I do acknowledge that there has been an interesting attack specifically on what we eat. And I personally believe that in this great spiritual controversy that we're in, there's good and evil. And if I were the evil one, I'd be like, well, let's go ahead and confuse what's good and what's not good in terms of diet, because if we do that, then what happens? we can influence the mental faculties a lot more negatively if people's minds are beclouded and if people are unhealthy. So that's food for thought. Another person said, I'm so pleased that you were brave enough to deal with this controversial topic. The then and now aspect of apple cider vinegar, knowing full well there would be backlash. I tried to communicate the information you shared here, but I am not scientific to point out where I could have done it justice. Praise to the Most High for your knowledge, willingness, and boldness. Thank you for that. One of the directors I worked for in the past used to always tell me, Faye, you can attract more bees with honey. So I wanted to just share that first section so that we can dive into the next section with an open mind. So the first section is section 1, biblical and theological reflections. I thought it would be best to categorize each section. That way we can compartmentalize these comments and these questions in a way that we can follow. All right, so the first question, how come Jesus didn't drink vinegar? A very good question. It was asked multiple times, so this was my response. It's true that Jesus was offered a vinegar-like drink on the cross, but scripture tells us it was vinegar mixed with gall. So it wasn't vinegar alone. You can read that in Matthew 27, verse 34. A narcotic herbal substance, this is the gall, is a narcotic herbal substance used by the Romans to sedate those being crucified. After tasting it, Jesus refused it. But not because it was vinegar, and I'll explain why in a second, but because it would have dulled his mind, most likely because of the gall that was present. He chose to endure the full suffering of the cross fully conscious. And there are other theological interpretations as to why he did this, but Mrs. White touched on him refusing to have this mixture because it would numb his mind. You can read about that in Desire of Ages. Interestingly, a second offering of plain vinegar, of just the sour wine, is mentioned in John 19, verse 29 through 30, and that time he accepted it. Not as an intoxicant, but likely some interpretations say to moisten his mouth before declaring, it is finished. He was offered vinegar mixed with gall initially. He rejected that and then was offered a second offering of vinegar that was just the vinegar and accepted it. And in some of the translation, it says, it doesn't just say he wet his lips, it says he drank it. So let's just leave it at that. I have no other explanation aside from what's in the Bible, but I just want to clarify it was not just vinegar alone. So while vinegar and alcohol share a fermentation origin, they're chemically very different. Vinegar contains virtually no alcohol, often less than 0.3%, and cannot intoxicate the body. Yes, most likely vinegar at that ancient time probably wasn't perfect and had maybe higher levels of alcohol. Cannot have such a strong acidic flavor if it still contains lots of alcohol in it. So just to clarify, the sour wine would be unlikely to cause that level of intoxication. This next comment, just an honest question. Do you consider Ellen White's writings inspired, all or some? Someone responded to this person and said, I don't think she does, without referring to me. I don't think she does based on her intro, which I don't know where they would have gotten that, since I clearly stated in my intro that I'm a practicing Adventist. And then they say, but I can be wrong. You're most definitely wrong. Most Adventists in our church today don't believe that she's a prophet, so I wouldn't be surprised, but it's not fully her fault if she doesn't believe. However, I appreciate the research. So it is kind of like a sad truth that many of the Adventists in the Adventist church are struggling with their stance on Mrs. White, and I am not in that camp. I do believe that the majority of her writings were inspired, but I want to bring to your attention that Mrs. White wrote over 100,000 manuscripts, and there are clear distinctions where she says, I was shown that, or the angel of the Lord showed me that, or thus saith the Lord. And in these contexts, I believe that those statements that follow were indeed inspired. This is a very big topic. I don't intend to get into it today, but I did want to address this just so that you understand where I'm coming from with these videos. So this was my response to them. If you watch the entire video, you'll have a better understanding as to the answer. The ending is where the whole emphasis and purpose is, which also outlines my personal stand. And if you watch the full video on vinegar at the end, I'm like, basically explaining, I do believe in the spiritual and moral soundness of Mrs. White's writings, and I don't believe those are subject to change. However, when it comes to the dietary counsels, in most cases, the counsels that were provided were written for her specific time, and that some aspects of them are subject to change or to reasoning that can allow us to remember what the big picture was, and her big picture was health and wholeness. I also responded with this comment. I have not met another person within the Adventist network that has read and reread Mrs. White's works as I have. And I say this to put my response in perspective. Most Adventists do not even read a single book through. When I say I've reread them, I mean it. So the Conflict of the Ages series, the Desire of Ages alone, I've read over 16 times. Patriarchs and Prophets, Prophets and Kings, I've read that 6, 7 times each. Acts of the Apostles at least twice. The Great Controversy, I've read sections of it, but I haven't completed that one. But for example, other books, Messages to Young People, I've read at least 5 times, especially when I was in high school. Life of Christ or Steps of Christ, I've read that at least 6 times, 7 times maybe. Maranatha, Our High Calling, it's more of a daily devotional. I read that like maybe 6 times or more. Mind, Character, and Personality, volumes 1 and 2, read those several times over. Ministry of Healing, I've read twice. The book Education, I believe I've read that twice. Last Day Events, I believe I read that. I'm reading right now Adventist Home, Child Guidance, and Counsels on Health. Obviously, I've read multiple sections of Counsels on Diets and Foods, and I've read different sections of Testimonies to the Churches, and I've also gone through many of her manuscripts. So I say that just to establish that I believe much of her work was inspired. So I share all of that again to put my response in perspective. So I'll go ahead and finish reading this. Based on this, I believe that much of her work was inspired. I also believe that she wrote freely of her own personal beliefs and perspectives on certain topics, which she was entitled to do. Do I believe every single word she wrote? And she wrote, like I mentioned before, over 100,000 manuscripts. Do I believe every single word was inspired? No, I don't believe that. And I do not believe that she expected us to either. Now, this was a very moving and meaningful comment. Thank you so much for this series of videos you presented to us. I'm passionate about nutrition and Ellen White's writings, and you've helped me reflect on certain topics that are more difficult to understand. My only sincere question is, if it was the Holy Spirit who guided Sister White, and I believe it was, to write about the health message, wouldn't he give us more precise information, warning us that the times and the science would advance and things would be different in the future? Just as she warned us about meat, eggs, and dairy, how can we study these controversial topics without diminishing the Spirit's strength and power to communicate truth that can be understood through time until the end and the return of Christ? I mean, this is a really strong, important question. For example, here in my church, everyone is a fan of gluten-free products because science says gluten is bad, which I disagree with. How could God have simply forgotten that in the future there would be genetically modified organisms or GMOs and allowed Ellen White to write so much about the benefits of whole wheat bread? Sorry for the long text, but these are questions I always ask myself because I believe these topics are very important for reflection. Very loaded question. I'm not going to be able to touch all of it here, but I did want to share my response. So I said, I can greatly relate with the tension you're describing. These are the very questions that have moved me to study deeply, not to diminish the Spirit's work in Sister White, but to honor it more fully by understanding it in context. Ellen G. White herself acknowledged the idea that light and understanding is progressive over time, meaning she was aware that not all the light would be provided to her at her time. And then this is a quote. She says, "We must not for a moment think that there is no more light, no more truth to be given us. We are not safe when we take the position that we will accept nothing more than that which we have understood." That's a pretty powerful statement. She also wrote, "The truth is an advancing truth, and we must walk in the increasing light." And then I went on to say that I do not believe this means her message was flawed. It means it was appropriate for her time, as it pertains to dietary counsels. And it was still instructive now when studied with humility, discernment, and again, when studied in context. I just want to jump in and add that in general, grains that are organic, that are not genetically modified like those that we find in Europe, and Europe won't even purchase our grain from the United States because we've messed with it so much, is among the most healthy foods that we could benefit from. And individuals who have sensitivities to eating grain here in the United States report being able to tolerate it very well when they visit Europe. So grains essentially are healthy, clean ingredients, and you don't need to be instructed for something like this because modern science is showing us that westernized genetically modified grains are bad. We don't necessarily need to have reported within the spirit of prophecy this direction or this instruction. We have reasoning power, and if people of the world or people who don't have spirit of prophecy are able to deduce this, then we could definitely go along with it and not feel that the Lord missed out on sharing this information with us through Mrs. White because of the gift of rationale that all of us already have. I also went on to say that in regards to vinegar, the vinegar at her time was simply a different product than what we have today. Like you, I believe these topics matter deeply, not just for health, but for faith. It matters. This is what led me into the series because I recognize that it matters. The goal isn't to let science override inspiration, but to let inspiration lead us to investigate more faithfully with reverence for truth in every form it comes. I mean, we're invited to utilize our reasoning powers. There is no reason for us to remain in the dark because it wasn't presented in 1867 that therefore it's no longer applicable or shouldn't be applicable now. That's not the case, and I don't believe that that's a rational, Adventist, correct way of thinking either. So I went on to say the forest of her message, so zooming out, let's not focus on the tree. The forest of her message was what? Health and wholeness. She did not advocate for blinded commitment to isolated comments. Mrs. White was an extremely moderate woman and wrote with a rationale that was far, far in advance of her time. Remember, her dietary comments were counsels, not commandments. There are only 10 of those. I am grateful to walk alongside others who are wrestling thoughtfully and prayerfully with these things. Okay, section 2, Mrs. White and the role of inspiration. I have a couple of comments and questions here. Sister White spoke about the process of making vinegar. The apples used rotted during the process. Barbara O'Neill also spoke about its negative effect on the brain. So this was my response. Thank you for your comment, and you're right. Mrs. White described vinegar as being made from rotting apples, which was consistent with how it was produced in her day, often through uncontrolled, unsanitary fermentation, again, established in the presentation. Modern vinegar, especially raw apple cider vinegar, is made through regulated, clean, and intentional fermentation, not decay or spoilage. I went on to say regarding Barbara O'Neill, I appreciate her work and have heard her speak both critically and favorably about vinegar. She often cautions against distilled white vinegar, but also acknowledged benefits of raw apple cider vinegar, especially when used properly and in small amounts. So that nuance is really important to consider. So the presentation that I did explores those differences with respect for both history and current science, so viewers can make informed decisions based on principle and not fear. And I do feel that so much of the Adventist counsels that have been adhered to for so long are not being adhered to for the health benefits, but more for the fear surrounding if they are not adhered. And I do not believe this is Christianity. I believe this is a different type of religiosity and virtuosity that has been attractive to certain people who I think may not have valued the moral and character development qualities that are of much more value than what you eat or don't eat. It's almost turning into a pharisaical situation, like you'll strain the gnat but swallow the camel, like you'll be vegan, let's say, which was never a truly Adventist belief. It was more of a oddly evolved doctrinal belief system that kind of made its way into the Adventist church, but it was never foundational. Like if I'm vegan, I'll be saved, but I never have to forgive my brother or I never have to be kind to this person. And I feel that I've seen that, and I think other Adventists can attest to this as well. This person wrote, I'll stick to Ellen G. White's advice irrespective of better modern techniques. I've seen the results of people using vinegar. My uncle died as it caused a stomach ulcer bleed. Now, this is a perfect example of people taking association and turning it into causation, which is a major flaw in scientific understanding. There could have been 100 other factors that contributed to this person's uncle's stomach ulcer bleed. But it's what happens when individuals take anecdotal considerations and biased mindsets and try to superimpose it on certain scientific claims. My comment was the recommendation was for everyone to use their own judgment on this matter, which was how I prefaced the presentation. My purpose is merely to present the data. If this helped you reach a more foundational conclusion, then the goal was met. So I'm okay with this person disagreeing or believing that vinegar is terrible. I am not advocating for the use of vinegar. I am advocating for scientific and historical rationale being used in perspective. This person wrote, so are you saying if Mrs. White lived today, she would not say anything against vinegar? So, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Mrs. White's overall message was health and wholeness. Based on that goal, I do not believe she would have stated it as wrong to have vinegar today in moderate doses for those who do not have acid-related digestive disorders. As stated in the disclaimer, I am not telling anyone what to believe. I am merely sharing the data and inviting viewers to draw their own conclusions. Adventists around the world today, this is really important, are consuming far worse ingredients biochemically from processed foods than what's found in vinegar. Perspective always matters. This person wrote here, Ellen White was human and she was not perfect. She advised us on what to eat and what not to eat. But at the end of the day, if it's not in the Bible, it's her counsel. It's up to us to take it or leave it. For example, cayenne pepper, ginger has many benefits, and I use them all the time. So my response was, I have found that in many circles, and you guys can probably relate to this, Mrs. White has been held to a very high standard, almost an infallible one. People tend to forget that she was also human, and her counsels on diet particularly were directed to the circumstances of her time and for her time. They were most definitely useful. Again, these particularities were counsels. They were not commandments. Let's remember again, there are only 10 of those. Plus, she clearly stated that what works for some would not work for others. The goal is overall health. Whatever will take you towards that should be in line with her counsels. Now, I'll refer you back to the quote where she literally states, we have not set any particular line in diet. It's not set because human health and human needs are fluid. We're not all the same. And she acknowledged this. So I think it's just a major doctrinal, somehow labeled Adventist belief system that she laid forth a very strict ideal. She didn't. She said every person's body was different. And whoever started to run away with this and advertise it, I don't believe this is in line with Adventist thinking and reasoning because it's very inconsistent with the moderate stand that Mrs. White took when it came to these things. This person wrote, I take great exception that one woman should lay down the rules for what humanity should eat. So here we see it again. The thing is, she didn't. She never laid this rule down. This was a false doctrinal belief system that somehow entered into the church and spread out over the past 100 years. In fact, here's what I state. She provided some counsels, but she also stated, we do not mark out any precise line to be followed in the diet. So this is just a false doctrine. It's a false doctrine that entered our church, and we've allowed it to enter because it's so attractive to individuals who feel like their works are going to save them, and that is a problem. That is a problem in the spiritual growth of our church, and it is a hindering and dwarfing effect on the church when we start adopting these false doctrines and making them like they're a part of the spirit of prophecy. He states, we do not mark out any precise line to be followed in the diet. Why? Because Mrs. White was aware that every person's body was different. At one point, she had 16 people living in her house and spoke about what works for her stomach, doesn't work for other people, and what works for other people's stomachs don't work for her. And they just managed to work around that so that everyone's happy. And she goes on to say, we do not mark out any precise line to be followed in the diet because that's not logical, nor reasonable, nor scientifically sound to do so. Section 3. Here are some of the comments that go through scientific objections and health concerns. Okay, this was a very interesting one. Have you ever seen what vinegar can do to metal? I used vinegar to clean rust off of tools. It works beautifully to remove and eat that rust away. At one point, I immersed some very badly rusted tools in vinegar and left them there for a week or so. My tools turned black and were pitted beyond use. That settled the vinegar question for me. If it can do that to metal tools, what can it do to my body? I don't want to find out. I ate sweet pickles in potato salad. I ate dill pickles in sandwiches. I ate ketchup and mayonnaise and occasionally salad dressings with vinegar. I gave up on eating that way after reading about Mrs. White's writings. Well, I would say you're better off doing that since these more processed versions of condiments are actually overall not healthy, and science supports that. Lemon or lime juice makes a real good substitute once you let go of vinegars, and I totally agree. I am not advocating for the use of vinegar. I am more trying to state the facts in context of historical and scientific soundness. This person went on to say, you may not now understand the issues of why she said not to use vinegar. We may not understand why until Jesus explains it. I may have it wrong, but then I'd rather err on the side of obedience than on what science says. Tobacco was once used for lung health. Alcohol is supposed to be good for our health too. By the way, the science does not support this. Sometimes we find out why, sometimes we won't, at least for a while. So, Dr. Kazzi, I respectfully disagree with the good benefits of vinegar. God bless. Very respectful, but I believe very inconsistent when it comes to understanding how the body works. If you go back here, they talked about how rust could be degraded by vinegar, and for those reasons, vinegar, therefore, is considered something this person would never consume because of the high acidic availability of the acetic acid. And here was my response. Thank you for sharing your experience so thoughtfully, and you're right. Vinegar can remove rust from metal. But, this is the interesting part, our bodies are incredibly designed to handle much stronger acids. Our stomach naturally contains hydrochloric acid, which is about, that's not a typo, 10,000 times more acidic than vinegar. 10,000 times. And at any given time, your stomach can contain 20 to 100 milliliters of hydrochloric acid, nearly a half a cup at one point in the stomach. You could have that much. Nearly a half a cup at any given time. And it functions daily without harm, a testament to the miraculous architecture and physiology of the stomach. I believe God takes credit for that. And while vinegar might erode rust and cause damage to metal over a week's time, hydrochloric acid can dissolve some metals within minutes. This is important to keep the facts in perspective. That said, I respect your choice to avoid vinegar as a matter of conscience. As mentioned in my disclaimer, it is not my goal to convince anyone. My aim is to explore Mrs. White's counsel in historical context and offer clarity based on current food safety and science. I truly appreciate the respectful disagreement and wish blessings to you as well. But I do believe it's important to understand the physiological and biological principles associated so that you can make an even better decision, not one based on anecdotal personal bias, but one based on truth. And as a scientist who's also a Christian, I believe and advocate for the search of truth, not isolated incidences that make sense to me, but more truth. This was a very interesting comment. Likely the main offense of vinegar is incomplete fermentation of ethanol to acetic acid, which we talked about. This leads to some ethanol and acetic aldehyde in the solution. The latter is a highly addictive and toxic substance. Modern processing methods can ensure more complete fermentation. However, condiment manufacturers process drinks like kombucha and even apple cider vinegar with the mother, the acetobacter, can also contain physiologically significant amounts of acetic aldehyde, forming food addiction and causing health issues. Now, this is very interesting. I'm not going to go at length in this video, but Mrs. White actually spoke about a personal testimony of her addiction. She described it perfectly as what we would label now in the literature. She described personal addiction to vinegar at a certain point in her life. She disclosed this experience as she was reaching out to a sister in the church through a letter and explained that it took much prayer and it took much resistance to overcome her overwhelming desire for vinegar. Now, we don't see that today reported in the literature. People are not getting addicted to vinegar anymore. But at her time, it appears that most likely these byproducts in the form of incomplete fermentation and possibly the acetic aldehyde, more primitive ways of producing vinegar, could have contributed to creating addiction. I'll talk more about that in another video, but this is very telling and this is very interesting. Glad this issue is being agitated. So this was my response. You bring up a really important point. Acetaldehyde is indeed a toxic byproduct, and incomplete fermentation can leave trace amounts in certain vinegars and fermented drinks. While most modern commercial vinegars undergo strict processing to minimize this, variability exists, especially in homemade or small batch products, and even in some natural beverages like kombucha or raw juices, as you mentioned. I go on to say, I appreciate your note about the modern methods, about how modern methods can help ensure more complete fermentation. This could be a key distinction between the problematic vinegars of Ellen G. White's day, which we talked a little bit about her personal experience, and what's available now. So essentially two different products. This area definitely deserves more attention, one which I plan to follow up with, especially as it relates to food addiction and metabolic health. The last section, and there's only one comment here. Practical and lifestyle alternatives. I received multiple comments about the same topic, so I just selected one to represent. I've just recently learned to cook. Didn't have time to, but my wife retired from cooking. I have tried to minimize the use of processed food. I have been substituting lemon juice for vinegar, not bottled lemon juice, but freshly squeezed, which is great. Since fresh fruit and vegetables are available year-round, I don't find a need to preserve food. Don't know how to either. Why should I buy vinegar if I don't need to? Never told you to. I did enjoy your video, lots of good common sense. Looking forward to your video on baking soda. Haven't used it in cooking yet, use it for toothpaste. Cute comment. Okay, in my response, you don't need it per se. This was more to address what appeared to be a very confusing topic within the Adventist space. And you're also right to point out that lemon juice is a wonderful, healthful alternative. And for some people with sensitive digestion, it may definitely be the better choice. I am not advocating vinegar as essential, only that we view it fairly. This is the most important thing. We review things that are brought into question with fairness and with discernment. Both scientific evidence and spiritual discernment is necessary. So thank you for your comment, and I hope you find the other videos beneficial. So that right there is addressing some of the comments that we had under this video. I hope you found this information helpful. The purpose of these presentations is to help us as Adventists to have faith in our practices and our beliefs and in the counsels that we've received. Counsels that appear to be inconsistent with what modern scientific research is showing us need to be reasoned with. I mean, we have mental faculties for a reason. Just because Mrs. White stated something at her time wasn't appropriate to utilize doesn't necessarily apply to our time, especially when that product has changed in so many biochemical ways. Thank you so much to everyone who engaged with this content. Please feel free to go ahead and subscribe and post your comments and questions below. I think this helps broaden and improve and strengthen our understanding of areas that I think are important for our overall adherence to our values and principles as Adventists. And I think that is the big picture and the goal of why I do these videos. So yeah, feel free to continue the conversation and let's continue growing and learning together. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you again for watching.